he's been the Canadian PM for nearly 9 years, and now the country wants to get rid of him. He's even been accused of becoming a dictator. Justin Trudeau is in hot water after a federal judge ruled that his use of the Emergencies Act in February 2022 to quell a peaceful protest and then to seize bank accounts of his political enemies was ruled unconstitutional. Even at the time the decision was contentious, it's only been used in extreme cases of public anarchy. As you can imagine, there has been quite the uproar throughout Canada.
Mr. Trudeau, the federal court has ruled that the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. Would you resign or apologize to Canadians for violating their rights?
Guys, at the time, I know that you are across this story, obviously February 2 years ago. This was a huge truckie protest happening in Canada, went on for a month in Ottawa. What did you make of this use of Emergencies Act being instated? I'll start with you, Maddie.
Yeah, well, I think that as with so many reactions to the COVID pandemic, that it was terrifying to me how very quickly and easily so many politicians around the world reach for the most extreme measures. And in Trudeau's case, it was invoking these emergency powers. And the protests had erupted because the truckers were, many displeased about the idea of vaccine mandates, which was, again, another thing that was deeply, deeply illiberal. And I really felt a strong sense of, I suppose, despair, because although I think Trudeau went above and beyond the call of duty and being, like, aggressively authoritarian, it felt like a more extreme version of what we were experiencing here in the UK. And no one seemed to call it out.
No.
You know, at the time, it felt like very few people were calling it out. Many warned at the time, for example, that vaccine mandates would increase vaccine hesitancy and scepticism, and that is now borne out on the data. You have loads of children not being vaccinated for measles because they oversold the COVID vaccine and created mistrust. Basically, all the warnings came true, and yet still, I don't think people really want to talk about COVID and take stock of what happened.
Out of sight, out of mind now,
exactly.
I think is the going thing.
Yeah.
James, as someone who's worked in government, this was an Emergencies Act that was instated in 1988. It had never been used before because it was meant to be the most extreme cases of anarchy. What do you make of someone that's actually worked in government to put something in place like this? Do you think that it's accurate to describe Justin Trudeau as becoming a bit of a dictator?
Well, I do think it was absolutely extraordinary. And Maddie mentioned in the last piece about the kind of the vow of silence amongst so many American journalists about Biden. So little of this got covered here in the UK, and probably not very much in America either. I don't know around the rest of the world. There was this sort of weird silence about it because there was, you know, it was almost a class issue, right? This was truck drivers who were saying something that most people kind of knew, that sort of makes sense intrinsically. And when you have those sorts of factors together, that's when politicians get scared. It's fine with you look at these idiots who threw some soup on the Mona Lisa because they'll all have fancy trust funds and rich lawyers, and it's a kind of class thing there. Or in 2020 in the UK with the Black Lives Matter protest, you suddenly started having these people attacking police horses out on the streets, and suddenly lockdown didn't matter then. 100%. But when it was working class truck drivers, he comes and smashes down because, you know, you're safe from the chattering class.
And they were losing a lot of work, and it became a huge issue with the supply chain in both the US and Canada.
Exactly.
So I think everyone was like, well, you can't force us. And obviously it's easier to say this in hindsight because COVID was such a big deal and it was, you wanted people to get vaccinated or whatever it may be. It was hard to kind of govern that. I do kind of sympathise with any government who was governing during COVID. Honestly, I don't know how anyone could have done that and made every right, wrong decision. But at the same time, this protest was, you know, it became such an uproar situation. But I want to throw to this because I was like, Trudeau's government said at the time that the situation was justified to use these powers.
You defended those when you announced them at the time. Do you have any regrets on taking that measure in the light of this decision? Would you have done it differently based on what we've seen from the federal court today?
As I said in my opening remarks, we faced, as a country and as a government, an incredibly serious threat.
But now it looks like he could be facing political oblivion at the next Canadian election, and the media are already writing his political obituary.
Every reputable pollster in Canada has been in agreement for months that the next federal government will be Conservative, and that it's likely going to be a majority. That's typical after 3 terms of a Liberal government, but where this is getting weird is that there doesn't appear to be a floor for Justin Trudeau's unpopularity. Pierre Poilievre won't just become Prime Minister, he'll really become Prime Minister. As in, he could win one of the greatest landslides in more than a generation.
Is he out, guys? Is he out next year?
I sure hope so. I mean, Pierre Poilievre is amazing, and he gives me hope. In this country, the Conservative government has failed on so many basic metrics. It has absolutely nothing to say, for example, about the housing crisis. But in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, he gives this extraordinarily positive and optimistic vision of conservatism, which is so depressing when compared against politics in the UK. And obviously, he's helped by Trudeau having massively over-egged the pudding when it came to the pandemic and the authoritarianism, etc. But I also think Pierre Poilievre has done an extraordinary job of leading that party.
It does seem that for so long, I think that people looked at Trudeau as this really good-looking Liberal leader that could bring people together. Maybe maybe the Canadians' version of New Zealand's former Prime Minister Jacinda. But it does seem that you look at him on surface thinking that he is just this good-looking guy that can work the room, a bit of a Gavin Newsom in California in that regard. But it feels like, you know, the wheel's falling off here.
It's just a complete double standards, right? This guy being a kind of lefty liberal lovey type. The guy turns up in multiple pictures wearing blackface, right? And oh, well, that was just a youthful indiscretion. Can you imagine what would have happened to someone like Boris Johnson if there'd been a single photo of him dressing up in something like this, right?
And there seemed to be like several dozen of Trudeau. I mean, he was barely out of blackface at uni by the looks of things. And some of it happened when he was actually a professor, I think, or a senior, like a PhD student. So not a kind of 19-year-old undergraduate, but definitely too old to be in blackface.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just shows that not learning lessons of these things, right? Again, in the UK, it was difficult inside government to know how you do these things. It was difficult at the very start. Everyone was scared. We didn't know how fatal that the virus would be for lots of people, all the rest of it. Look at our stupid COVID inquiry now that's focusing on mean words people were texting each other rather than the actual lessons being learned. Right, truck driving, it's a real job. Stuff's got to get from A to B. Whether you're a civil servant or in the UK or one of Justin Trudeau's apparatchiks, you can just like stay in your nice big sort of state subsidised house somewhere and do Zoom calls and not have to come back into the office, and the real world doesn't really affect you. That's why COVID didn't matter so much for them, but for the truck drivers, they were totally justified, and hopefully they vote Trudeau out as well.
Well, we'll be watching that closely. He's up for election. He says he's running in October next year, so we'll be seeing if we're moving on to a Conservative Party in Canada.